So in this lesson, we're going to learn about a new way to solve a quadratic equation, and this is called completing the square. So far, the ways that we've learned to solve a quadratic equation is that we can always graph, and that is because remember that the solutions are the x-intercepts, or where does the graph cross the x-axis. Does take time, sometimes harder if there are fractions or decimals. So then we have our square root method. But remember, the square root method only works if there is no middle term. For example, if we had something like this, 2x squared plus 14 equals 0. So there's no bx, no middle term. So this other method that we've talked about is factoring, and factoring if it's possible. And we also want to remember that if the leading coefficient is 1, so it makes it easily factorable. For example, if we have x squared plus 5x plus 6 equals 0. We can make our big X, and we can put 6 in the top and 5 in the bottom. What two numbers multiply to be 6 and add up to be 5? And that would be 2 and 3. So when we factor, we get x plus 2, x plus 3 equals 0. So our solutions are x equals -2 and x equals -3. We also learned that we can always use the quadratic formula no matter what. That will always work as long as we remember that a is the leading coefficient, b is the number in front of the x, and c is the number by itself. So today we're going to learn about completing the square, and we only want to use this method to make it easiest for us if the leading coefficient is 1 and the middle term, the b, is an even number. So let's go back to where we had foiling. So if we were to FOIL x plus 3 times x plus 3, we would get x squared plus 3x, and then we'd have 3x again, and then 3 times 3 would be 9. So when we combine like terms, we'd have x squared plus 6x plus 9. This is a perfect square trinomial because the x plus 3 is twice. It's a square. We write it out twice when we want to multiply it or FOIL it. So in order to find and writing in what we want for the perfect square, we take half of the middle term, half of 6 is 3, and then we square it to get 9. Half. So we're going to take the b value and we're going to divide it by 2, and then we're going to square it to get that perfect square trinomial. So let's try to do some perfect squares. So take half of the middle term, half of 12 is 6, and 6 squared is 36. And if we were to factor it, this is what it would look like. X plus 6, the quantity squared. Half the middle term, 14 divided by 2 is 7, and 7 squared is 49. When we factor it, it would look like x plus 7, the quantity squared. This number is always half of the b. Next, y squared minus 10y. Half of -10 is -5. -5 squared is 25. And if we were to factor it, it's always the b value that goes after the variable. And we're going to cross out this term, this one, because it is not an even number, and it ends up being a decimal or a fraction. And we're not going to work on those during this section in this unit. Okay, so let's do an entire problem. So first thing we need to do is to make sure that we move the c to the other side. So we're going to move the c value to the other side of the equation, and we're going to draw blanks because we need to fill in the blank to complete the square. Okay, now we're going to take that middle term, that b value, and we're going to divide it by 2. 10 divided by 2 is 5, and 5 squared is 25. So we're going to add 25 to both sides. Once we add to one, we add to another. Now we're going to factor it. Okay, we could make our x, and we could put 25 in the top, 10 in the bottom, and we would want to know what two numbers multiply to be 25 but add up to be 10. Would be 5 and 5, or the shortcut is just to make sure you take half of the b value. There would be 2 of them, so we'll just put it squared. Then we combine like terms. Okay, the last part is we're going to solve for x. So to do that, we want to get rid of that square. So we're going to take the square root of both sides. A square and a square root cancel each other. So we have x plus 5 equals, don't forget your plus or minus, and the square root of 49 is 7. So now what we're going to do is we're going to subtract 5 from both sides, and then we have 2 math problems to solve. We have 7 minus 5, and we have negative 7 minus 5. 7 minus 5 is 2, and negative 7 minus 5 is negative 12. So those are our 2 solutions when we complete the square. Okay, let's try another problem, and I'll be telling you honestly that in this problem we're going to not have our answers work out as nicely. So the first thing we do is we subtract 2 from both sides to get the c on the other side of the equation. Then we rewrite the problem by putting blanks in so that we can remember to complete the square. Next step, take the negative 8 divided by 2, which is negative 4, squared, which then is 16. Then we're going to add 16 to both sides. Now we're going to factor, and we'll take the shortcut. Remember that you just divide the b by 2, and that's going to be our factoring. Then we'll combine like terms. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take the square root of both sides to solve. A square and a square root cancel. Don't forget your plus or minus, and 14 does not simplify at all if we make a factor tree, so we're going to leave it as a root. To finish the problem and to get x by itself, we're going to add 4 to both sides. That number comes first, followed by our plus and our minus and our root. This as well is 2 answers because it would be 4 plus the square root of 14 and 4 minus the square root of 14. One more problem. This time the c value is already by itself, so all we have to do is draw our blanks. Now we're going to take the b value and we're going to divide it by 2, which is 1. And 1 squared is 1, so we're going to add 1 to both sides. Now we're going to factor, and remember when you factor you can make your x. Since the c is already moved, we had one less step to do. When we factor, we divide the b by 2. And remember that that would be squared. There would be 2 of them, and we're going to combine like terms. Now we're going to take the square root of both sides. Remember, a square and a square root cancel. Don't forget your plus or minus, and the square root of 36 is 6. So to finish the problem, we're going to subtract 1 from both sides. So this time we're going to work out 2 separate problems because it does not have a root. 6 minus 1 would be 5, and negative 6 minus 1 would be negative 7. So those are our 2 solutions, and those are the steps for solving by completing the square.